One of the things that I am personally the most passionate and happiest about in the way that we've been able to approach formulation is that like the way that we're resourcing the brain and the nervous system so that there can be these progressively higher degrees of intelligence across all of the domains, but in a way that also makes you more human, that makes you care more, that makes you calmer and more resourced to be able to handle the stressors of life and to be able to do it in a way that is loving and compassionate. Because I think ultimately that's the thing that we're all striving for.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Kelly, VP of Product Development at Qualia. Our podcast often delves into topics related to mental well-being because issues like brain fog, mental exhaustion, and supporting long-term brain health are common concerns. That's why we make Qualia Mind. Our new and improved Qualia Mind formula required thousands of research hours, reviewing hundreds of ingredients until we identified 32 vegan, non-GMO brain nutrients and compounds that together form the ultimate blend for brain health. From focus, memory, mood, the drive to get things done, Qualia Mind supports everything you need to have a thriving mindset. We think you'll notice the brain-nourishing difference fast, and that you'll appreciate its support for healthy brain aging years down the road. To try Qualia Mind risk-free for 100 days, go to qualialife.com/mind and use code MIND for an additional 15% off your order. That's qualialife.com/mind to experience the ultimate blend for brain health.
Welcome to today's episode of Collective Insights. I'll be your host. My name is James Schmachtenberger. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Qualia Life Sciences, and today I'm joined by Dr. Greg Kelly. He's the head of research and product development for the company.
Yeah, we have an exciting show. We're going to talk a little bit about nootropics, a lot about the brain, and then introduce you to the new and improved Qualia Mind.
So I guess before we dive into nootropics and Qualia Mind, I wanted to share a little bit about why we decided to do this in the first place. So when I was about 21, I hit a very severe degree of burnout. I had been running my first company for a few years, had no idea what I was doing. So I was working 18, 20-hour days for about 3 years and got to a place where, for the most part, my brain just stopped functioning. I went into adrenal failure. Even though I was working on things that I was passionate about, I started having depression. I couldn't recall things. So I ended up starting down my own healing journey. And, luckily, because I was already in the sort of natural product space, I was able to get exposed to some of the best kind of cutting edge opportunities for healing. And there was one therapy in particular that I did. I went down to Mexico and I went and did this experimental IV therapy. So for 3 days in a row, I was doing 8 and 9 hour IV drips. And with many therapies, you can notice somewhat of a benefit. But when I did this, it wasn't minor. It was like this life-changing, like the lights came back on kind of an experience where all of the cognitive challenges that I was struggling with completely went away. And not only went away, but my brain function came online at a level I had never experienced before. And in addition to that, all of the sort of sense of blah and depression and hardship was sort of replaced with a sense of excitement about life, capacity, competency. And as I really healed my brain, one of the things that stood out most profoundly for me in that experience was that my empathy went through the roof. And after that moment, it became essentially impossible for me to start to think about what I wanted to do in the world without immediately thinking about the broader implications of what those actions were going to be. And it was in reflection of that particular set of therapies where I realized that, most people would never even know about these types of experimental therapies. But when I started to think about what was possible if my experience could be replicated, right? If we could have a population of people who were dramatically more intelligent and, not just having better focus, but having better critical thinking, better discernment, better reasoning, all the different facets of intelligence, felt profoundly capable and competent and by feeling more empathetic, also had this inherent desire to use their greater capacity, not only for self-gain, but to help the world at large. I realized that if that was possible, it could be a really powerful, really meaningful thing. But there was nothing that existed in the world that was even remotely accessible at the time to be able to deliver on a concept like that. And so that was actually the driving force behind starting the company and building what was the original version of the product that we're now relaunching. I'm excited to say that we've been able to achieve quite a lot of that. Maybe not everything, because there are certain unique effects that come with intravenous therapy that can't be achieved in any other way. But I've yet to find anything else on the market that can produce as profound of an effect. And because part of the fundamental and underlying orientation was how do we bring the absolute cutting edge of what's possible, we've made the, I'll say, somewhat difficult business decision to never be stagnant and to continually iterate on products whenever there's new ingredients, new research that allows them to be better. And so today we'll be talking about the new and improved version of Qualia Mind.
Getting to what you mentioned in your journey, it's important to understand how central the brain is to how we show up in the world. And this oversimplifies it. But when you think of your brain, think of like it does certain big jobs. One is making sure you're alert and able to pay attention. So we just at Qualia, we call that focus. Another is usually a bundle of things that are thought of as executive functions. But these are your, ability to hold information in your brain as you use it. So neuroscientists call that working memory. Another one's being able to change your mind as new information comes in, and that's thought of as cognitive flexibility. There's other executive functions too, but think of those as, planning, setting goals, and then doing all the things, the hard work to make those happen. But then there's what you mentioned, the empathy, and neuroscientists call that social cognition. So this is, our ability to have empathy. This is our ability to really put ourselves in someone else's shoes and get a sense of like, how are they feeling? What might be going on in their brain at this point. And then it's also like our own emotional self-regulation as part of that, right? Like being able to staying calm sometimes when that's challenging. And our brain lets us do all those things. But to do a really good job, it has to have enough resources. And, usually at Qualia, I'll just use the term mental energy to encapsulate all of that, right? We have so much mental energy, kind of a reservoir to then do all of these different jobs. And what you would see in the real world is often people show not the best versions of themselves in one or more of these areas. Maybe they showed up as the best version of empathy at 10 in the morning, but by 5 in the evening, not so great. They've kind of used up some of this mental energy reservoir. And so a big part of what I think of as the Qualia Mind story is it's just giving so much more in terms of resources to be able to draw from, to do all these important things, but to do them in a sustained way and still have gas in the tank when we get home to interact with our loved ones.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about, supporting cognitive enhancement, there's so many different facets, but I do feel like this aspect of mental energy is sort of central. I think for a lot of people, it's somewhat obvious, but what are some of the most common things that people would notice if they are lacking enough mental energy?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to focus on. And just stepping back, so our brain uses about 20% of all the food energy that we consume in a day. So it's a voracious consumer of just energy. And what you would see, just if you were doing imaging of the brain, is if a part of the brain is working harder, there's going to be more blood flow there. And what the blood flow is doing is bringing glucose and bringing other things so that the brain can work harder in that particular area. And one of the areas, and I often think of it, the part of our brain that allows us to do the hard thing when it's the right thing is the prefrontal cortex. And so what you would often see is when the mental energy reservoir is running low, a lot of the prefrontal cortex activity suffers first. And so these are things like, instead of like staying focused and getting work done, like, oh, I'll just check my phone. I'll do something that's more mindless activity. Instead of being focused at the gym and intensely concentrating on each repetition, it's letting my mind wander or listening to music and be kind of somewhat plugged in. So, One is you just see the abilities to sustain focus starts to diminish pretty rapidly. Another would just be like what you often hear people describe as brain fog or lacking mental clarity, right? Like they're aware that their brain's just a little sluggish. It's not quite firing on all cylinders. A big one, and I think of my dad. He's passed away now, but my dad was a super hardworking person, long commute from the suburbs where I grew up into the city to be the eventually president of a big engineering company. And then, long hours of work. And when he came home, we would always feel like, oh, we have to walk on eggshells because we didn't know which version of dad would walk through the door. Would it be the one that's a little bit more on edge and irritable? And, or is it one that's going to kind of be a little bit, I would say, the better version of dad? And I think that's common. And my story there is my dad, between the commute, between not getting enough resources for his brain, the long hours of working his brain in a certain way, by the end of the day, he was just depleted of resources. So the version of dad that walked in the door was going to be a little bit more moody and irritable. And so that would be another classic sign that your brain's running low. Our ability to self-regulate our emotions isn't what it would be at our best. And so, just think in terms of resources. When we have more, what we tend to see is, the things like irritability, mood issues, dealing with stress, inability to focus, our memory feeling like it's a little bit off, our motivation being in the tank. All those things are characteristic of what happens when our brains run short of mental energy.
And I think that's a pretty universal experience. Like I think almost everyone has both experienced it themselves and experienced with other people, where mental energy gets depleted and then, they're struggling with things they wouldn't normally struggle with. They're sharper or harsher in the way that they interact.
Yeah. And I think like my mom was, I was a child of the 60s and 70s, and my mom was the homemaker at that point. And there was 6 of us. So huge, job, right, to be a homemaker there. And my mom, I would say almost across the board, always showed up like a really loving, she was the antithesis of my dad, which was great. We needed that balance. But there was times when, as a mom doing all these things, we taxed her mental energy, right? And then, right. And then, a more irritable mom would come out. And so, long story short, when someone in our lives doesn't show up at their best, the way I understand this is it's not about their character or their personality. The story is really like more foundational, like their brain needs more support than it was getting. And that's a big reason why, you created Qualia, so that we could, have the Qualia Mind to offer those people and support them better.
All right. So we talked about sort of the central theme that mental energy plays and kind of what happens if mental energy is depleted. Let's talk a little bit about how one can increase mental energy.
The way I just think about it, like a lot of energy in our brain goes to making neurotransmitters, to powering our senses so we can hear and see, right? So the sensory, like gathering information. And then quite a bit goes to what would be protecting the brain. So the brain is very sensitive to stress, metabolic stress, just from using all of that energy. So, at the most foundational level, what I think of like, we want to get more nutrition to the brain. I almost think of like a car engine that's running really, really high. We need more fuel, right? If we're going to drive it for longer distances, but we need the oil and the other things that are going to protect the engine. So when I think of, what do we do? Often it comes down to those big categories. We want to make sure there's more fuel. We want to make sure the brain's supported so that it can burn that fuel. We want to make sure that we're doing things so it has lots of resources to protect itself. And then since it's so reliant on neurotransmitters to communicate, we want to make sure that we're doing things to really support the neurotransmitter system. So these are the communication systems in the brain, like, the dopamine to create motivation, and the acetylcholine to support learning and memory and plasticity. We want to make sure that those systems particularly have everything they need to perform at their best.
And then, so the types of compounds that support the production of all the different neurotransmitters, these are often referred to as nootropics.
Yeah, quick history lesson, but the idea of nootropics came about from some work that was done in the 60s, and I think the term was coined around 1972 by a Romanian chemist and pharmacist that was trying to create things that worked on the GABA system in the brain, which is kind of the brake of our brain that helps with calmness and things like that. And inadvertently, he created this compound that when he gave it to animals, they just learned faster and behaved as if they were smarter. He said, oh, that's kind of cool. What should we call these? And he came up with the word nootropic, and it was based off French words. The Romanian language is also a Latin-based language like French. And nootropic meant mind-bending. And I would think of that today as meaning what we think of as brain plasticity, that ability really for our brain to reshape itself and learn. And so nootropics over time became used as a way to describe anything that really helps our brain think better. And it turns out that there's a lot of compounds, some from ancient traditions like Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine, from some European traditions, and some things that are more in the vitamin, amino acid world that today we realize and understand, oh, these things help with neuroplasticity. They fundamentally help our brain to think better.
So I think, it's been interesting to watch over the last several years because there's been a lot more popularity around the concept of nootropics, but I think there's also a perception a lot of people have that they're only for like a certain subset of people, right? Like nootropics got really big in Silicon Valley or within like the biohacking movement. And so there's a lot of adoption there. But when you start to look at other groups of people, with aging brain or people who, maybe aren't trying to build a, multi-billion-dollar tech company, but just want to go have life be easier and happier, there's somewhat of a maybe misconception that nootropics aren't for them. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think they were the early adopters, is how I would say it, right? They were the people that cared a lot about having their brain perform at its highest level because it was important for their jobs. So the Silicon Valley people, university students were another early adopted group of nootropics. But if I'm asked, like, well, Dr. Greg, who should take nootropics like Qualia Mind? And well, everyone, right? It's like, who wouldn't benefit in their life, in their relationships? I mean, what's really important to them if their brain was doing better in these big cognitive areas like social cognition and executive function and being able to have more, focus and attention and ability to concentrate. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see its progression, but I think the term nootropic tends to pigeonhole it into those communities that you mentioned, where really things like Qualia Mind, it's like, you want your brain to work better, you want more brain benefits, we've got the product for you.
So we're talking about this like really broad category of nootropics or sort of brain health supplementation, but can you speak to maybe a few of some of the more common, more understood ones?
Without question, the most used nootropic compound on the planet would be caffeine. It's in coffee, it's in green tea, it's in things like yerba mate or guayusa. So I think I've seen statistics that about 80% of the planet drinks beverages that have caffeine. And I think of caffeine and just stepping back, in my mind, I think of cognitive skills almost as a pyramid. And the base of that, the foundation, is being awake and alert. Like having the right amount of vigilance is how neuroscientists would say, to then be able to get to focus. And caffeine, better than any other substance on the planet, sets that foundation, right? So we don't want crazy amounts of caffeine, because then, what you would classically see is some of the things I mentioned. Caffeine will cause us to burn a lot of fuel and resources, and we'll almost kind of bonk, right? We'll get more edgy and irritable. We'll get things that show that your brain has used up mental energy. So, caffeine does that really well, but you don't need a lot of caffeine to do that. And really the goal of caffeine is just enough so that you have that base of the pyramid. And then I think of the next level up is everything that falls into what's usually thought of as complex attention. But this is your focus, your ability to multitask, to avoid distractions, to respond quickly, right? Processing speed. And then above that, if that layer is taken care of, then you can get to social cognition, your empathy, and your, executive functions. And so when I think of what are some things used, caffeine, right, is used, but then how do we bring the best out of caffeine? And so that brings us to L-theanine compound that's found in green tea. That's an amino acid-like thing that complements caffeine. So what you would see is that stack or that combination tends to be experienced much more as a calm, centered energy. Theanine with caffeine tends to bring out the best of both. You get, that layer of the pyramid, but you start now much more to move into the next level up. Great focus, calm energy, an ability to feel like you handle stress better. And then there's other things that I think get you more into like saffron. And as an example, I would think of as more your archetypal social cognition that helps with mood, helps with empathy, helps with the things that come about from, being higher on the pyramid. But one of the reasons I think of it as a pyramid is if the foundation's not there, the chance we're going to get higher up is really low, right? So, that's why, at the Qualia brand, we put things together to kind of support the whole pyramid of cognitive function.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned 3 out of about 27 different ingredients that we're working with.
So yeah, the Qualia Mind, the original, had 27. The new Qualia Mind, what I've always been referring to internally as Qualia Mind 2.0, but the new and improved Qualia Mind has 32 ingredients. So even more nutrition for the brain.
Let's talk a little bit about the reformulation. What drove the decision to do that? What are some of the changes? What are some of the different ingredients?
Yeah, well, I think this would be a good chance for you to take a little of the mic and tell like the transition from original Qualia to Qualia Mind to, what's now the new and improved Qualia Mind.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, this isn't our first time to iterate the product. Right? When we launched this Qualia Mind originally in 2016, and when we first launched it, it was actually a 2-part product. There was one that you took first thing on the morning on an empty stomach, and then another that was taken with either breakfast or lunch. And it was a spectacular product, but it was a little too hard for most people to want to take. I think there was a total of 12 capsules, and, having to remember to take different pieces at different times, where at that point we had kind of isolated the importance of empty stomach versus with food. Became a struggle. And so even though the product was great, one of our main aims with the company was how do we help as many people as possible? And a lot of that went to accessibility. If we made something that was too difficult for people to remember to take, it didn't achieve the goal. So a few years ago, shortly after Greg joined the team, we set out on the difficult task of trying to turn this very, very complex 2-part product into a single formula that could be taken either with food or without food, while trying to retain all of the benefits and even get some additional ones. And that took, I don't even remember how much, but an obscene amount of research. This product has had, I think, more research than probably anything we've done, literally thousands of hours of R&D and dozens and dozens of iterations of different formulas. With that, we were able to create something that was really quite effective and has been used by hundreds of thousands of people, has been used in all kinds of different studies, all types of different people from, the Silicon Valley, people living kind of at the bleeding edge to aging populations to sort of everyone in between. And even with all of the new products that have come on the market, we really hadn't seen anything that was able to accomplish everything that formula was able to accomplish. But for us, the scientific bar isn't set by what else is in the market. It's set by what do we think is possible. And that last formulation was done, I remember, 3-ish years ago. And since then, as this field has grown, there's been entirely new types of ingredients that have come out, but also new technology around extraction where certain ingredients were able to be created more potent. And over the years, we've just continued to study brain health, brain chemistry, everything. And so we realized there was an opportunity to upgrade it even further. How do we make something even more impactful in all of the key areas, right? Better mental energy, better focus, better reasoning. And it seems like we were successful. So coming back to the product, Lion's Mane is one of the ingredients that we brought in that wasn't previously there. Share about some of the other ingredients that weren't in the previous Qualia Mind that are now present.
I kind of categorize things in my brain into a few different groups. So one would be like bringing back some old favorites. So Lion's Mane. Magnesium was another thing that was an original 2-step Qualia Mind that, for listeners, magnesium, the amount of elemental magnesium, something is a % of what you have to put in, right? So magnesium aspartate is what is going to be used in the new and improved Qualia Mind because it's the form of magnesium that's helped hearing protection. So it's done some other things as well, but only a percentage of the total compound is magnesium. And the input of magnesium elemental can range from some compounds, it's like 5%, some, 25, 30%. But, magnesium takes up a lot of capsule space. That's why it had to be sacrificed way back. But we wanted to make room for it. And this because it's still one of the most important compounds, minerals for brain energy, for mood, for, lots of other things the brain does. So that would be another bringing back an old favorite.
There was a really fascinating study done last year by a woman named Dr. Heather Sandison. And not the new version, but the previous version of Qualia Mind was part of that study. Curious if you can share a little bit about that, and then where you see this new version maybe even being able to be more effective.
Yeah. So Dr. Sanderson, she actually hosted Collective Insights for a period of time, and I loved her as a host. She's gotten really busy in other areas and has always been in her clinical practice and interest all about the brain. She does a lot of work with the aging brain. These are your memory that starts to struggle for a lot of people as we get older. But, mood and other, really all of the areas I mentioned, motivation, focus, all of these things often struggle as we get older. So, in this group that she was working with through her clinical practice, she did all of the steps needed to do a clinical study that could get published. And during that, she did a comprehensive intervention on these people to help with their memory. So older group. And so, that included working on sleep and working on toxicity and working on eating better. She had a lot of people do a keto style of diet. And she also did supplements. And the way she used Qualia Mind in that study, she would have said Qualia Mind was my brain multivitamin. Like it was my multi-nutrient. I wanted all of these people in my study to be on to give just that foundational support for their brain in the areas we've talked about. And what she found in the course of her study is that in these people who had fairly substantial declines in memory, the vast majority over the course of her study had significant improvements. So Qualia Mind was just one piece of the overall recipe of interventions, but it was still, a really intriguing study that she undertook. And she'd been using Qualia Mind in her practice in that same use for many years, right? So it's why she had the confidence to use it in her study. And, part of the reason I think new and improved Qualia Mind is even a better fit for Heather's use case is that, to get to 7 capsules to 6 meant, losing some ingredients, but, putting in some new things. And one of the things in the new Qualia Mind, like my simple story, is it's more brain nutrition, more brain essential nutrients, and more benefits all in fewer capsules. And so some of the things that were added in specifically would be things like the lutein, like the magnesium. We have all the B vitamins now instead of just a subset of them. Things that are really helpful as nutritional support as the brain gets older. So, I think it's even a better support for an aging brain than original Qualia Mind. A few other things I had mentioned, Nutricog added in, much more robust support for learning than we had in original Qualia Mind. Because of lutein and zeaxanthin, we have a lot more vision support. And, for an aging brain especially, as vision goes, a lot of our brain performance goes. Magnesium, I mentioned that magnesium aspartate we included in new Qualia Mind is the form of magnesium that in 4 human studies back in the 90s helped hearing, and especially hearing in the context of noise stress. And we already had elements like PQQ and taurine that help with hearing. Taurine helps in the visual system. Saffron's another ingredient that there's some good vision research. So, another thing that we were able to do, when I say more benefits, there's more support for learning, there's more support for vision, there's more support for hearing. These things that are just really important if we want our brain to perform at its best as we get older. So the new formula is an even better fit for the use case of Dr. Heather.
So you've mentioned it a couple of times. I'm curious to just sort of go a little bit deeper on, so you mentioned ingredients that we're including that, primarily have been studied for vision or primarily studied for hearing. And I'm curious, in your opinion, is it that that's maybe what their primary study has been, but they have explicit benefits on the brain as well? Or is it more related to the amount of use and stress that the brain goes through in processing senses?
We had talked about energy, in general, like the brain is a voracious consumer of energy. And, a lot of that is for neurotransmitters and a lot of it is our senses, right? So even when we're asleep, our brain is consuming a lot of energy, one, to do all the jobs that happen during sleep, but also because our hearing is still working hard while we're asleep, right? Making sure the environment around us is safe. So I also had mentioned that there's 6, kind of big categories of jobs the brain does. And, these are your executive functions and social cognition and attention. But one of those is visual spatial, right? Like as our visual system and senses move through space, right? And then how that feeds into the brain. And that's how we learn, right? Like we watch any child, right? It's going to reach into the world with its senses, right? Its hearing, its vision, its touch, and then get feedback from the world. And that's how its brain learns, right? So we're a visual organism, right? As humans, most of us that, are sighted humans, the visual part of our brain takes up a lot of real estate. So, if you take lutein and zeaxanthin as an example, since those are, classically thought of as vision ingredients, right? And the reason that they're vision ingredients is because at the very back of our eye, there's what's called the retina. And in the central part of the retina, that's important for like our focus, our focal vision, right? And contrast of colors and all these important jobs. The pigments that I would think of as they act as shade there, for lack of a better way to describe it, are lutein and zeaxanthin. So they concentrate in that part of the retina, which then led, people doing research to think, oh, these are vision ingredients. Let's, look at these for blue light stress and for like flicker and all these other things that stress the retina. But it turns out they also concentrate in parts of the brain. So I think of lutein as an example is the most concentrated carotenoid, because that's what these are in the brain. And so because of that, scientists eventually decided, oh, let's look at these in cognition as well. Let's look at things like neuroplasticity. So BDNF would be a way people look at that brain-derived nootropic factor. Let's look at it for visual memory, right? Because it's concentrating in parts of the visual brain. There's probably a reason for that. So, while if you went to a supplement store, you'll probably see lutein and zeaxanthin in the vision section of the store. These are very much cognitive ingredients as well, with a lot of research. I want to say there's been 9 human placebo-controlled double-blind studies on lutein and zeaxanthin for cognition alone, plus all the ones for vision. And then there's many more where those 2 compounds were, maybe put together with saffron or some other ingredient as well. So, that's why I put them in my underappreciated category, right? People don't realize the extent that those are important for our brain and the quality and quantity of research that's been done on them. And then lastly, like I said, if our senses start to fail us, then our brain follows closely behind. Like they're not disconnected things.
One last thing I wanted to have you speak on a little bit is what are the effects that people can generally expect with taking Qualia Mind, and like sort of the progression of that? Like what happens in the beginning, what happens after a little while, what are the long term?
Yeah, so I've mentioned trade shows. You and I have both done trade shows in the past, and we'll often have day packets of Qualia Mind that we give out then, and we'll say, just take this, and then, you come back tomorrow if you want another one. And so what we hear in terms of like the first day experience is people usually notice a big uptick in that like alertness, focus, but like alertness. They just feel more like, oh, like I'm here, I got this type of thing. And then, through say day 1 through 5, by the end of 5 days, we're already starting to see people comment about motivation, about focus, and about energy. That my big 3. And then what usually would see between week 1 and week 2 is even more uptick in those. So if on average, people notice 50% improvement, maybe that's up to like the high 60s% after 2 weeks. And then, things like memory, social cognition, those take longer, right? So usually around 30 to 60 days, people start to notice, like my memory feels a little bit sharper. I'm not as irritable at the end of the day when I go home, to my family, or I've got more juice in the tank. And when I first started with Qualia, at some point, I think it was, say, like 3 to 5 weeks in, I noticed what I thought of as, oh, this is a procrastination killer. Like, I just want to get to work. I don't want to goof around at the beginning of my day. And somewhere in that 6 to 8 week, it had made enough difference in what you said, like that empathy, so what I think of as social cognition, but I had more compassion for other people, right? And less tendency to get irritated with someone at the end of the day, whether that was driving home in traffic or, being, I was doing trivia with some buddies at a bar at that point, and all of a sudden just noticed, like, oh, when someone says an answer that's clearly wrong, like, okay, that's okay. like we're good. And so I just felt like at some point that had built a lot more capacity to be patient with people. But that took longer to happen and longer for it to stand out in my brain that there'd been a change there.
That empathy piece is just so important too, right? Like, it's something that the world doesn't typically have enough of. And one of the things that I noticed, because I've been in this field for a while and like really spending time studying intelligence and what drives it. And oftentimes you find that some of the most intelligent people are also some of the least empathetic, which is a little bit terrifying, right? Because they then often have the most influence based on intellect. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm personally the most passionate and happiest about in the way that we've been able to approach formulation, is that, like, the way that we're resourcing the brain and the nervous system so that there can be these progressively higher degrees of intelligence across all of the domains, but in a way that also makes you more human, that makes you care more, that makes you calmer and more resourced to be able to handle the stressors of life and to be able to do it in a way that is loving and compassionate. So I think ultimately that's the thing that we're all striving for, right? It's not just how can we get more done and destroy things in the process or be miserable, but how can we be able to be incredibly effective, incredibly motivated, and more human, more connected, more present, more empathetic. And to me, I consider that probably like the biggest success that I think we've been able to accomplish here.
Yeah, I agree. Caffeine would be an example, right? Like, caffeine's a really useful nootropic. It does, that arousal, aspects of attention really well. And, many people probably know of, examples maybe of other people they've encountered that when they do too much caffeine, they become less good versions of themselves, more grouchy, more irritable, overconfident, but, no empathy, right? So we don't want to, and Danny would have said this at the beginning, right? We don't want to make those kinds of trade-offs, right? We want, let's have enough caffeine to allow it to do what it does well. We don't need more than that. What we need is things that help these other capacities. And we certainly don't want to trade the more valuable ones for the less valuable ones.
Right. So in the very, very early days of the company, when it was just myself, my brother, and then our other co-founder, we were experimenting with every compound that we could find, including a lot of the like really, really potent synthetic ones. And we had been like creating these stacks of all of these like racetams and ampakines. And it was amazing how much we were getting done. Like, kind of ridiculous. We'd get, 5 days worth of work done in like 6 hours. But after a few weeks of this, all of our girlfriends and our wives at the time had an intervention with us. And they all walked in there like, okay, guys, we appreciate how intelligent you are. And you've kind of become assholes and we need you to stop it. And it was the perfect check, right? Because the intent in the beginning was intelligence with empathy. And in our excitement and zealousness to like push the envelope as much as possible, we had gotten too far into the areas of like drive and hyper focus and had sort of lost that. And it actually ended up being like the check and balance that brought the whole thing back around.
That's one of the things I know I hear periodically through customer service or people when I interact with them. It'll be the opposite, right? They'll be on Qualia Mind and for some reason stop it, for a period, right? Maybe because they just want to take a break, or maybe for some other reason. And then their significant other will say, like, you really need to start doing that again because you were better when you were on it. So,
right. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess as we're wrapping, you wanted to share a little bit about what else is coming down the pipeline over the next...
Yeah. So as we're recording this is the beginning of August. I'm not sure when it'll air, but we're going to launch what's called Qualia Magnesium Plus about mid-October is when it's scheduled for. I know I've taken the prototypes. You've taken the prototypes. It'll be, I feel like by far the best magnesium product that'll be on the market. So I'm super excited to share that with people.
Before we close, anything that we didn't touch on that you would want to share in closing?
No, I just think, the people that have spent their precious time listening to James and I want to thank you for your support. And, you're the reason we do what we do. So I'm excited to share new Qualia Mind with you. Take advantage of it. I think you'll love the product and that we do, right? And at the end of the day, I know I often step back and like, okay, well, let's make products that we really love taking ourselves. And if we're able to do that, then we'll help people.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you to everybody. Hope you've enjoyed this episode and hope that you get a chance to try the new improved Qualia Mind.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.